Okay, well, let's do a bit of review as to where we were at when we left off last time. The book of Ezra was obviously written by a guy named Ezra, who was a scribe and a priest. He was a direct descendant of Aaron, so he's in that priestly line. That book is set during the height of the Persian Empire, and it chronicles the story of the Jews who returned back to their homeland, and specifically to Jerusalem, after being taken captive to Babylon during the days of Nebuchadnezzar. So the Persian king Cyrus issued a decree allowing the Jews to return to Jerusalem. Just a quick reminder, here's the timeline that we had put together, the kings of Persia there, and then some of the Bible books and prophets that are happening around that period. We mentioned that Ezra is broken up into two sections, and there's actually like almost a 60-year gap between the two halves of the book of Ezra. And then Haggai and Zechariah were prophesying at that time, and then some of the world events that were going on too. So we'll maybe flash that up a couple more times just to kind of keep in mind where we're at historically here. Well, we've been studying this first section of Ezra, which deals with the return to Jerusalem and the rebuilding of the temple, and this effort was led by Zerubbabel. This was the first of 3 returning trips that the Jews made to Jerusalem. Now, it's interesting, in Ezra, there are no miracles recorded, but instead we see that God is still in charge. He's ruling over the rulers of the earth with a quiet power. God used the Persian king Cyrus as his agent to fulfill prophecy. He not only issued a decree allowing the Jews to return, but he also encouraged them to do so. He told the people of the land to provide gold, silver, and supplies and animals to help them on the journey. And he also brought out the temple utensils that Nebuchadnezzar had stolen, that they could be returned to Jerusalem. Well, Ezra wanted his audience to value temple worship. He wanted them to appreciate the effort that went into this project of rebuilding the temple. So he wrote this book 2 or 3 generations after the events happened. He did not want his readers to forget or take the temple for granted. Last week we looked at the list of those who made the return journey. While we don't recognize most of the names, and they're hard to pronounce, we found that there were some nuggets of truth that were in the list. We saw the name of the leader, Zerubbabel, who was the grandson of Jeconiah, the last king of Judah. Jeconiah was evil and disgraceful, and God removed the signet ring from him. But we learned that God restored the signet ring, representing authority and honor, to Zerubbabel, his grandson. There were also some important towns in the list. Men of Bethlehem came, which of course is important because that is where Messiah was prophesied to be born. We also saw Jeremiah's hometown of Anathoth was in the list. And that is the town where God told Jeremiah to go and buy a piece of land at a time when nearby Jerusalem was under siege by Nebuchadnezzar. So this land was, in a sense, God's pledge to Jeremiah, that he would fulfill his promise and bring the people back from Babylon when the 70 years were complete. And we also noted that the list maintains the historical record of God's people. It reminds us also of another list God is keeping, and that's the Lamb's Book of Life. So God cares about each of his children, and he calls them by name, and we saw that last week in that long list of people that returned. Well, tonight, the exiles arrive back in Jerusalem, and they begin the process of rebuilding the temple. So we'll read these verses beginning at the end of chapter 2 through the first 7 verses of chapter 3. And as always, if you just jot down any important words or phrases, we'll use that to do our overview. So Ezra 2, beginning in verse 68. Some of the heads of families, when they came to the house of Yahweh that is in Jerusalem, made freewill offerings for the house of God to erect it on its site. According to their ability, they gave to the treasury of the work 61,000 derricks of gold, 5,000 minas of silver, and 100 priests' garments. Now the priests, the Levites, some of the people, the singers, the gatekeepers, and the temple servants lived in their towns, and all the rest of Israel in their towns. When the 7th month came, and the children of Israel were in the towns, the people gathered as one man to Jerusalem. Then arose Jeshua, the son of Jozadak, with his fellow priests, and Zerubbabel, the son of Shealtiel, with his kinsmen, and they built the altar of the God of Israel to offer burnt offerings on it, as it is written in the law of Moses, the man of God. They set the altar in its place, for fear was on them because of the peoples of the lands. And they offered burnt offerings on it to Yahweh, burnt offerings morning and evening. And they kept the feast of booths, as it is written, and offered the daily burnt offerings by number, according to the rule as each day required. And after that, the regular burnt offerings, the offerings at the new moon, and at all the appointed feasts of Yahweh, and the offerings of everyone who made a freewill offering to Yahweh. From the first day of the 7th month, they began to offer burnt offerings to Yahweh, but the foundation of the temple of Yahweh was not yet laid. So they gave money to the masons and the carpenters, and food and drink and oil to the Sidonians and Tyrians, to bring cedar trees from Lebanon to the sea, to Joppa, according to the grant that they had from Cyrus, king of Persia. Okay, so what were some important words or phrases in those verses?
Free will.
Yeah.
Their towns.
I'm sorry, their towns.
Towns.
Law of Moses, the man of God.
They kept the feasts.
Yeah.
For fear was on them?
Fear was on them?
For fear was on them, and according to the rule.
Okay, that's great. Those are really important phrases that we're going to run into tonight.
Gotta have altar to God.
Okay, get one more here. Okay. Well, chapter 2 gave us the list of family names and city names of those who returned. And then abruptly in verse 68, we see the travelers have arrived in Jerusalem and they're at the rubble of the temple. And all we have is they left and then they go to the temple. So unlike the Exodus from Egypt, this second Exodus from Babylon has no events recorded. We're not told of hardships or encounters with adversaries or miraculous provisions. There's no parting of a sea, nor a pillar of fire or cloud leading and encompassing them on the journey. Were children born? Did anyone die on the way? There's no manna from heaven or water from a rock, nor is there any golden calf or disobedience recorded for that matter. Now, we're not to speculate about what might have happened. Rather, we're to conclude that the journey back was a fulfillment of God's promise given through Jeremiah. The important thing was not the details of the journey, but the faithfulness of God and also the task that they faced when they arrived. The returned exiles are focused on restoration of worship. Well, the distance from Babylon to Jerusalem is approximately 600 miles by the route that they took. And if you can see on this map over here, kind of in the middle, is the city of Babylon. And they followed this, if you can see this darker blue dotted line that kind of heads up. It's called the Fertile Crescent route because it follows that crescent. It goes up into what we now know as Syria in the town of Aleppo and then down. This is a longer route, but it's an easier route than trying to cut across the Arabian desert. So they didn't do that. They went up and around. Now we read later in Ezra that Ezra made the journey from Babylon to Jerusalem. He did it with a much smaller party. He didn't have 50,000 people. And we read there that it took him 4 months. So because the longer journey and the greater people, we don't know for sure, but it could have taken Zerubbabel and the group up to 6 months to make that journey, going up and around. So it was a big deal, almost 900 miles. In verse 69, we read that the returned exiles contributed free will offerings to the rebuilding of the temple. Now, this followed the same example that their ancestors did when they built the tabernacle in the wilderness, and later when Solomon's temple was built. So let's take a look at that. When the tabernacle was built in the wilderness, God had specific designs on that, instructions for that. And then we read in Exodus 35, 4 through 9 and 20 through 21, what happened.
Moses said to all the congregation of the people of Israel, "This is the thing that the Lord has commanded. Take from among you a contribution of the Lord, to the Lord. Whoever is of a generous heart, let him bring the Lord's contribution, gold, silver, and bronze, blue and purple and scarlet yarns, and fine twined linen, goat's hair, tans, rams, skins, and goat skins, acacia wood, oil for the light, spices for the anointing oil, and for the fragrant incense, and onyx stones, and stones for setting, for the ephod, and for the breastpiece."
So the people,
I have to do
Oh,
20 and
sorry.
21. Then all the congregation of the people of Israel departed from the presence of Moses, and they came, everyone whose heart stirred him, and everyone whose spirit moved him, and brought to the Lord contribution to be used for the tent of meeting, and for all its service, and for the holy garments.
so we see that pattern there. People's hearts were stirred, and they brought in these free will offerings to help fund the building of the temple and putting together some of the priest garments and the stones that were in them. And we saw the same principle happening when Solomon's temple was built, and that's in 1 Chronicles 29, 6 through 9.
That was me. All right. Then the leaders of fathers' houses made their free will offerings, as did all the leaders of the tribes, the commanders of thousands and of hundreds, and the officers over the king's work. They gave for the service of the house of God 5,000 talents and 10,000 derricks of gold, 10,000 talents of silver, 18,000 talents of bronze, and 100,000 talents of iron. And whoever had the precious stones gave them to the treasury of the house of the Lord in the care of the Gershonite.
So we see this pattern. The people, these are not tithes or any obligations that people have, but they're coming with their free will offerings, building the tabernacle, building the first temple, and now in the rebuilding of the temple here in Ezra. Verse 69 goes on to say that they brought 61,000 derricks of gold and 5,000 minas of silver as their free will offerings. And we can read right through these words, and they really don't register with us because we don't have any frame of reference for them. It's hard to translate what the value of a coin was from 2,500 years ago to now. So estimates of how much this represents vary widely, but let me give you a couple of examples here. We know how much gold there was in one of these gold derricks. And so we can do a little math. There will be some math tonight, I should have warned you. So if we do a little bit of math, we can take the total weight of those derricks and multiply it times, the current price per ounce of gold. And if we do that, we come up with something like $25 million. So they've got a lot of money there. And if we take that same approach with the silver, we come up with somewhere around $3 million. So all this together is, could be getting around $30 million. That's the most conservative estimate. That's kind of the low end. But there's a different way to look at this, and that is maybe what the purchasing power of these coins would be. And then we come up with a much different number. So here's an image of a Persian derrick. It was named after King Darius. It was the most important coin in the Persian realm. It was used for large transactions. And it said that one derrick was the equivalent of 1 month's pay for a mercenary soldier. So 61,000 derricks could buy the services of over 5,000 mercenary soldiers for an entire year. So you want to buy an army for a year? Well, that's the amount of money it would take to do that. And to try to put a little perspective on that, bring it up to modern times, I went to the website goarmy.com, and goarmy.com says the average total compensation, which would be salary, housing, food, clothing, and there's a signing bonus for a first-year soldier going into the army, is $67,000. Well, if you want to hire 5,000 soldiers at that rate, that's over $330 million.
That's more than yours, mate.
Is that enlisted? Because we do officers too.
Yeah, no,
You gotta have the ranks.
yeah, I just kind of took the
crazy.
entry level for a soldier, right? So now, is that comparison the same? Well, it's just to kind of give you an idea, right? I mean, we're not, is a U.S. Army private the same as a mercenary? I don't know, what can it buy? Well, we're buying gasoline, they were buying bushels of wheat. I mean, we're 2,500 years apart, right? But to just kind of get some idea of what we're talking about, as far as purchasing power, this is a big number. And if we apply that same approach to the silver, that's another $150 million. So this could be $400 to $500 million that these guys have taken with them from Babylon on their march to Jerusalem. So sometimes we read this and we think, they just kind of went to the couch cushions for loose change, but no, it's really a very significant amount of money. So,
Heavy, too.
Must have been,
and heavy, right?
must have had special things to carry it.
Well, I think, Bill, you commented last week, they seemed like they were kind of light on their animals that they took with them. So, you kind of wonder what's going on here. But it's important to remember, they don't regard this as their personal money, right? It's been designated for the rebuilding of the temple. They were free will offerings that they brought that we read about here. So now we can understand that the amount of money that must have made them a target for thieves and robbers along the way. We also see the power of God's hand in protecting them and protecting that treasure as well.
Does the phrase free will offering suggest that this is beyond the Mosaic minimum requirement? The
Yeah.
temple offering?
Yeah.
Do we know if the temple offering was being made during the time of captivity?
I don't, there's no temple, so I think that whole system just kind of went apart. So there's no evidence that we have that they were collecting tithes.
Right, I mean, it was a requirement.
You're right. And I think that just kind of went by the wayside with the captivity. And also note that no one attempted to skim any money out of the treasure, right? Tuck a little aside for themselves. We talked last week about the city of Ai, and when the Israelites first went there, they lost their initial battle because one of their men, Achan, sinned. He took a cloak, 200 shekels of silver, and a bar of gold, and that resulted in him and his family losing their lives because they had stolen from the Lord and they were disobedient. Well, that didn't happen with these exiles on their return. They're dedicated to their mission of restoring the temple and temple worship. They gave according to their ability, it says, which turned out to be very generous free will offerings for the temple. The people also brought 100 priests' garments. These were fine linen garments with gold and silver highlights. And here's one example of what they might have looked like. They were clean garments that were provided for the priests. They symbolized the restoration of purity in worship and obedience to the Mosaic law. They look something like this. There were 4 parts to it. There was a tunic, and then leggings or undergarments. There was a sash, and then there was a hat or a turban, and that made up the priest's clothing. Rather simple, rather basic. And we can read about that in Exodus 28, 40 to 43.
What did you want?
Did I give you that one? Exodus 28,
I have Exodus 28, which one do you want?
40 to 43. Is that not on the list?
You didn't give that to me, but.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
For Aaron's sons, you shall make coats and sashes and caps. You shall make them for glory and beauty. And you shall put them on Aaron your brother and on his sons with him, and shall anoint them and ordain them and consecrate them, that they may serve me as priests. You shall make for them linen undergarments to cover their naked flesh. They shall reach from the hips to the thighs, and they shall be on Aaron and on his sons when they go into the tent of meeting, or when they come near the altar to minister to the holy place. Lest they dare guilt and die, this shall be a statute forever for him and for his offerings after him.
So that's an idea of the priest's clothing. Now, the high priest is a different matter, much more ornate. And you can see here some of the pieces of what he wore. God gave Moses specific instructions regarding these garments. That's also in Exodus 28, earlier in the chapter. We won't read through the whole chapter. We'll read some selected sections here that talk about some of these pieces. And you can see them here in this diagram. The hat or the turban, the plate at the bottom of the hat of pure gold, and the breastplate. The breastplate had jewels in it. The stones that were set there, one for each of the 12 tribes of Israel. There were ephods and breeches and so forth. So let's read about some of these. Exodus 28, that first section, 2 through 5, and whatever's on that first sheet there.
And you shall make holy garments for Aaron your brother for glory and for beauty. You shall speak to all the skillful, whom I have filled with the spirit of skill, that they make Aaron garments to consecrate him for my priesthood. These are garments that they shall make: a breastplate, an ephod, a robe, a coat of checkered work, turban, a sash. They shall make holy garments for Aaron your brother and his sons to serve me as priests. They shall receive gold, blue, purple, and scarlet yarns, fine twisted linen. And the skillfully woven band on it shall be made like it, and be of one piece with it, of gold, blue, purple, and scarlet yarns, and fine twisted linen. And you shall make a breastplate of judgment in skilled work. In the style of the ephod you shall make it of blue, gold, purple, and scarlet yarns, and fine twisted linen shall you make it.
That's good. That whole chapter 28 goes into a lot of detail about that, and maybe you can, if you're interested, you can kind of go through that on your own for more detail there. But you get the idea where Moses prescribes each of these pieces that are shown up there and how to make them.
Did the ephod used to light up for getting God's will? Wasn't it?
There were a couple of stones that were kept that were called the Urim and the Thummim, and we don't know exactly how they work, but we kind of think maybe they were cast and maybe they lit up or they fell a certain way. We don't really understand exactly how that worked, but somehow they used them to determine God's will. Yeah, and that was kept in like a pouch.
Wish we could have something like that.
You do us right here. So the one thing I would point out there is that there are no shoes. Okay, the high priest didn't have shoes, and that was a requirement for standing on holy ground. If you remember Moses and his incident with the burning bush. So a lot of symbolism in these vestments, but that could be a whole other study. So this was the high priest's outfit year round, except for one day. One day each year, the Day of Atonement, the high priest would set aside that ornate dress and he would wear simple white garments, much like what the priests wore. That day was the high and most holy day of the year. These garments are made from white linen and are commonly referred to as the white garments. They must be woven, and each thread used must be a 6-ply woven from 6 individual strands of fabric. The white garments represent the need for purity and the washing away of sin. Appropriate that he's wearing that on the Day of Atonement. They're a sign of humility and repentance. They also symbolize the spotless righteousness of the ultimate high priest, Jesus Christ. Including the priestly garments in the list of free will offerings points to the mission focus that these returning exiles had. Their intent was a restoration of worship according to the law. And to do that, they needed to have priests in proper attire. Well, the Jews first came to Jerusalem to see the site of the temple. Verse 70 says that the people settled in their own towns or their ancestral towns. And it mentions then Israel setting, all of Israel setting. So this isn't maybe a definitive evidence, but it does suggest that maybe there were Jews from other tribes that decided to come and join these folks from Judah that made the trek across from Babylon. That's one thing that gives some people the idea that maybe some of those, quote, lost 10 tribes came back. Well, some time has elapsed between the end of chapter 2 and the beginning of chapter 3. We're not given an exact time, but it's several months, maybe as much as a year, that's taken place. The people have settled in their own towns. They've built houses. They've planted crops. And we shouldn't see this as some kind of lack of devotion on their part, but it's just the logistic reality of their situation. They found themselves in a place where they have to live and have food to eat, so they've taken care of that need. And again, this enormous wealth they've carried with them was not used for their own purposes, but it's being saved and to be dedicated and rebuild the temple. Well, then it says in verse 1, or that they, it says in verse 1 that this happened in the 7th month. That is the 7th month of the Jewish religious calendar. It's also the 1st month of their civil calendar. So there's kind of a couple different ways they slice up the calendar. This is the month Tishrei, and it occurs on our calendar, what will be late September, early October timeframe. Now, this month was especially important because it included 3 of their annual festivals. There was the blowing of trumpets, the Day of Atonement, and the Feast of Booths, or Feast of Tabernacles. And we'll come back to those in a minute. But here's a reminder of what the Jewish calendar looked like, kind of set up against our modern calendar of months. And you can see down there at the bottom, month 7, Tishrei, and squeezed into Tishrei is the Feast of Trumpets and the Day of Atonement and the Feast of Tabernacles. Those are all part of that. And the first day of that month, it kicks it off with the Feast of Trumpets. So that's the time of the year that we're in here as chapter 3 begins. Well, verse 1 again says that they were living in their own towns, but then they gathered as one man to Jerusalem. And the meaning of this is that they were united. They were of one mind and one purpose as they come together in Jerusalem. It was a joyful time. If you remember, as we read the list last week, there were many singers that were among the exiles that returned home. And Psalm 126 is a song of thanksgiving for the return from captivity. Matthew Henry believes that this psalm was written by either Ezra or one of the prophets upon returning to Jerusalem. So it may not have been there at this first feast that they were at, but it would have been shortly thereafter. It is an expression of the great joy over the deliverance and a plea for God to continue his restorative work. And I think I'll give it to you, Alex. Alex will read Psalm 126 for us, and if you want to flip there and follow along, you can, but why don't you go ahead, Alex?
When the Lord restored the fortunes of Zion, we were like those who dream. Then our mouth was filled with laughter, and our tongue with shouts of joy. And they said among the nations, the Lord has done great things for them. The Lord has done great things for us, we are glad. Restore our fortunes, O Lord, like streams in the Negev. Those who sow in tears shall reap with shouts of joy. He who goes out weeping, bearing the seed for sowing, shall come home with shouts of joy, bringing his sheaves with him. Unless the Lord builds the house, a song of ascents of Solomon.
So this Psalm 126 was inspired by these Jewish exiles returning from Babylon to Jerusalem. A joyful time, a time of praise for God. You'll notice this is also referred to as a song of ascent, and it's one of a number of the psalms or songs of ascent. And they're named this because they would be sung by Jewish pilgrims as they made their way to Jerusalem for the various feasts. There were these 3 feasts during the year that required all males who were able to go ahead and make the trip to Jerusalem. And as they went on their way, they would sing these songs of ascent. And it's an ascent because Jerusalem's on a mountain, so you always go up to Jerusalem, and you always go down from Jerusalem. So those males who were able to make it were required to go up. And this continued for these feasts, the Feast of Passover, the Feast of Weeks, or Pentecost, and the Feast of Tabernacles. So the Jews continued to recall the fulfillment of God's promise of the return from captivity as they sang these psalms, even up until Jesus' day. They would be singing these psalms as they made the pilgrimage to Jerusalem. Well, their purpose is clear in verse 2. They want to worship correctly according to the law. The high priest Joshua arose with his fellow priests. The man who was in the kingly line, Zerubbabel, arose with his kinsmen. They found the location of the old altar, which was in the outer court of the temple area, and together they rebuilt the altar. These 2 groups, Ezra and Joshua and his fellow priests, and Zerubbabel and his kinsmen, rebuilt the altar of God in its place. They rebuilt it so that they could offer burnt offerings on it. Verse 3 tells us that they feared their enemies. So one of the reasons they began offering sacrifices was the danger they sensed from their enemies. Another reason was that true worship begins with confession of sin and an accompanying sacrifice. So this is an important insight into their spiritual health. The altar takes precedence over all other temple reconstruction because for these Jews, it was the heart of worship. They could not immediately have the temple, but they would not be without an altar. The Scottish pastor Alexander MacLaren said, "The ruined Jerusalem was better guarded by that altar than if its fallen walls had been rebuilt." Well, verses 4 and 5 tell us that they kept the Feast of Booths as prescribed in the law. They also offered daily burnt offerings in the number and fashion prescribed by the law of Moses. It was about worship the right way. They made the required offerings at the new moon and at the appointed feasts. They continued to make their free will offerings. They went about restoring all the prescribed routine of the Mosaic calendar. Well, verse 6 brings us back to the festivals, when it says that from the first day of the 7th month, they began to offer burnt offerings to the Lord. The first day of the 7th month was the blowing of trumpets, or the Feast of Trumpets. And we read about this in Leviticus 23, verses 23 to 25.
Again the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to the sons of Israel, saying, In the 7th month of the first of the month, you shall have a rest, a reminder by blowing of trumpets, a holy convocation. You shall not do any laborious work, but you shall be present. You shall present an offering of fire to the Lord.
Today we know this feast, the blowing of trumpets, as Rosh Hashanah. Rosh Hashanah means head of the year. And as we said, this is the beginning, even though it's the 7th month of their spiritual year, it's the first month of their civil year. So Rosh Hashanah, head of the year. It's the first day of this month of Tishri, and it initiates 10 days of consecration and repentance that led up to the Day of Atonement. Old Testament prophets linked the trumpet sound to judgment. We see this in Joel chapter 2, verses 1 through 3.
Blow a trumpet in Zion, sound an alarm on my holy mountain. Let all inhabitants of the land tremble, for the day of the Lord is coming, it is near. A day of darkness and gloom, a day of clouds and thick darkness. Like blackness there is spread upon the mountains, a great and powerful people. Their light has never been before, nor will be again them through the years of all generations. Fire devours before them, and behind them a flame burns. The land is like the garden of Eden before them, but behind them a desolate wilderness, and nothing escapes them.
When we read in Revelation, we see that John talks about the trumpets, and they're also announcing judgment or proclaiming coming judgment in Revelation chapters 8 and 9. But Paul also talks about trumpet sound in terms of the rapture of the church. 1 Thessalonians 4, 16 and 17.
For the Lord himself will descend from heaven with a cry of command, with the voice of an archangel, and with the sound of the trumpet of God. The dead in Christ will rise first. Then we who are alive, who are left, will be caught up together with him in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air. So we will always be with the Lord.
The next appointed feast they would have observed was the Day of Atonement. This was 10 days after the blowing of the trumpets, and we know this today as Yom Kippur. And this was prescribed to the Jews in Leviticus 23, verses 26 to 28, where we have a summary of it.
The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, On exactly the 10th of the 7th month, in the Day of Atonement, it shall be a holy convocation to you, and you shall humble your souls, and present an offering by fire to the Lord. You shall not do any work on this same day, for it is the Day of Atonement, to make atonement on your behalf before the Lord your God.
So it was a day for fasting and prayer and introspection. It was a day of cleansing and renewal for the nation. It was a day that foreshadowed Jesus' perfect sacrifice, whereby the veil in the temple is torn and believers have direct access to God. Well, we already read in verse 4 that they kept the Feast of Booths or Feast of Tabernacles. This was a joyous week-long harvest festival that began 5 days after the Day of Atonement. And we read of this in Leviticus 23, 33 to 36.
Again the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to the sons of Israel, saying, On the 15th of the 7th month is a Feast of Booths, for 7 days to the Lord. On the first day is a holy convocation. You shall do no laborious work of any kind. For 7 days you shall present an offering by fire to the Lord. On the 8th day you shall have a holy convocation, and present an offering by fire to the Lord. It is an assembly, you shall do no laborious work.
So this feast commemorated God's protection for the Israelites during their 40 years of wandering in the wilderness after they left Egypt. and how appropriate that they would celebrate this feast after they have seen God provide for them on their second exodus as they came from Babylon back to Jerusalem. It's a reminder to us of God's provision and his desire to tabernacle or dwell with us. And we read this in John chapter 1, verse 14.
And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. And we have seen his glory, glory as of the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth.
So the people have returned to the Word of God. In verse 6, they had another issue. The foundation of the temple was not laid. Well, they're now ready to turn their attention to the task of rebuilding the temple, and they're going to start with the foundations. In verse 7, we read that they began to use the funds that had been accumulated. They used money to hire their own men as masons and carpenters for the work. But they paid in kind. They paid with food, drink, and oil for the men from Tyre and Sidon to transport the cedar wood from Lebanon. Now, this was the same custom that was followed in the time of Solomon when Solomon built the temple. And we can see this in 1 Kings 5, 8 to 11.
And Hiram sent to Solomon, saying, I have heard the message that you have sent to me. I am ready to do all you desire in the matter of cedar cypress timber. My servants shall bring it down to the sea from Lebanon, and I will make it into rafts to go by sea to the place you direct. And I will have them broken up there, and you shall receive it. You shall receive it, and you shall meet my wishes by providing food for my household. So Hiram supplied Solomon with all the timber of cedar and cypress that he desired, while Solomon gave Hiram 20,000 cores of wheat as food for his household, and 20,000 cores of beaten oil. Solomon gave this to Hiram year by year.
So just as Solomon gave Hiram, the king, food, grain, in return for the lumber, so we see these exiles now are giving the same thing. They're giving food and drink and oil. It was a common practice because these towns of Tyre and Sidon are located in Phoenicia. It's a narrow area. There's not a lot of farmland there, and so they would commonly work for food, if you will. They'd work in kind for food and drink, so nothing out of the ordinary here. They depended on their neighbors for food. Well, the cedar trees would be cut down in Lebanon and taken to the sea. They were shipped as a large raft from the port to the port of Joppa, just as happened in Solomon's time. We see the same practice happening there. That's in 2 Chronicles 2:16.
And they're second Chronicles, huh?
Yes.
Oh, I have. Okay, I did first.
They're like,
And we will cut whatever timber you need from Lebanon and bring it to you by rafts, by sea to Joppa, so that you may take them up to Jerusalem.
so they cut the cedars, take them out to the coast, have kind of a giant log raft, and they ship them down to Israel, and they get off at Joppa. From Joppa, they've got to transport them to Jerusalem, which is about 40 miles inland. So once they get to Joppa, the journey's not over. They still have to continue to get them to Jerusalem and the temple. It says this was done in accordance with the grant they had from Cyrus. A little bit of question about what this means, because there's some people that question whether Cyrus actually had sway over Phoenicia. So Herodotus, the historian, says he did not. So maybe this isn't so much Cyrus's directive to the Phoenicians as it is it's in line with the directive that Cyrus gave that the exiles would return and rebuild their temple. Well, the laborers were hired, the timber is procured and it's on its way, and so soon the work on the temple can begin, and we'll pick up with that effort next time. So a couple questions to have a little discussion about. What did we see about God and his character in our passage tonight?
These things happen when he's disciplined. And he's got details to the nth degree. Just, it's really interesting. It's like so human to us, to me, when I see it, being a builder, right? Like, and having procurement and logistics, and he's got it all figured out. Even payment, which is like securing and transfer funds from the bank. Like, hey, maybe that had to be certified by a banker, and it received shipment, and an insurance agent goes out and inspects it. Like, these are big funds of money, sums of money, right? And how it all,
Yeah.
nobody took anything from it.
Yeah.
So, I mean,
Yeah, not like there's ever anything underhanded in construction, right?
yeah, I mean, I just talk to my handler every day about the bank funds, and he wants to make sure that they're releasing funds, so it's
Yeah.
interesting to see this.
Yeah.
God provided for them every step of the way. At the same time, I mean, the people did it. He provided, and it did not. It's not distinct from the people putting in the money or doing the work or the labor.
Mhm.
So it's both and. So it's God provides. It doesn't mean we just sit back and wait for temples to be built and altars to be built. They do the work.
Yeah.
Clearly, God expects us to be obedient. They already knew what temple worship was about. They knew what the clothing was expected. They knew festivals that were expected. They executed it. We responded to that.
I think for me, is that the fact that he wants us to be participants, right? And
Good work.
we all think that we just push cruise control, or we're like, oh, praise the Lord, it will happen. And I think we all sort of nuts and bolts of it all, and we have to do our part.
Well, let's pick up on one point we made there about when they started to build the altar. It said that they had fear of their neighbors. So what can we learn from how they dealt with the fear of their neighbors?
They didn't let it keep them from obedience to the Lord, like they will say. So maybe one of the ways you combat fear of a man is to submit to and be able to fear the Lord more.
Worship brings peace in the soul.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, because that was their response, was to build the altar and worship, yeah.
Faith.
Well, one more consideration. What can it mean to us to start with the altar in restoring broken areas of our lives?
Obeying God and seeking Him, His will, what He wants us to do.
Mhm.
Seek first the kingdom of God and His righteousness, and all these things will be added to you. If you feel all messed up and everything's chaotic and disordered, maybe start with first with the question in mind. Worshiping God first, and seeking Him first.
Taking action, doing it, and not what is the Yoda thing, right?
Well, and as we said earlier, I mean, it so often begins with confession, right? I mean, if there's something wrong, guess who's wrong? Okay, final comments?